She stepped off the train with a baby on her hip and hope in her chest, and within 10 minutes, both felt like mistakes. The blizzard hit Iron Ridge the same hour Naomi Carter arrived, as if the sky itself had decided to weigh in on her chances. Snow drove sideways across the platform. Her infant daughter pressed her face into Naomi's neck and whimpered. The station master looked at her ticket, looked at the baby, and said 4 words that would haunt Naomi for weeks afterward. Wrong stop, wrong town. If you've ever arrived somewhere and instantly felt the world closing against you, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train was already gone by the time Naomi understood what had happened. She stood on the platform of Iron Ridge Station, if it could even be called that, a warped wooden overhang nailed to the side of a supply shed, and watched the last car disappear into the white mouth of the storm. The sound of the engine faded until there was nothing left but wind, and the thin, fragile crying of her daughter Emma against her chest. Naomi didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood very still for a moment, the way a person does when their mind is cycling too fast and their body hasn't caught up yet, trying to count backward through everything that had led here. She was supposed to be on the train to Harlan's Crossing. That was where Victor Ashford lived. Victor Ashford, who had written her 3 careful letters, who had sent her a train ticket and a money order for the journey, who had agreed to marry her, and more importantly, to accept Emma as his own. Naomi had read those letters so many times the fold lines had worn soft. She had packed everything she owned into one carpet bag. She had told herself it was going to be fine. Somewhere between the junction at Millhaven and the long stretch of open plains, a conductor she'd never seen before had come through the car and told her this was her stop. She'd asked twice. He'd looked impatient. She'd gathered Emma and her bag and stepped off, and the train had not waited. Now she was here, wherever here was. "Excuse me." She turned toward the station master, a heavy-set man in a sheepskin coat who was already retreating toward the warmth of his shed. "Sir, I need to know, is there a connection to Harlan's Crossing from this station?" He paused with his hand on the door latch. His eyes moved from her face to the baby and back. "Not today." "When then?" "Soonest would be Thursday, weather permitting." He squinted out at the storm. "Way this looks, maybe Saturday." "Thursday." It was Monday. "Is there a hotel in town?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Mrs. Holt rents a room above the dry goods store. You'd want to ask her tonight before she locks up." He pulled the door open, letting a blade of warmth escape into the cold. "You got money for a room?" Naomi hesitated just long enough for him to read the answer. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Emma was 8 months old and had been patient about the whole situation for as long as any 8-month-old could reasonably be expected to manage. She'd slept for most of the journey, nursed when she was hungry, watched the passing landscape with those wide, unblinking eyes she had. But the cold was something new. She wasn't built for it yet. Her little body had no reserves to draw on, and within 10 minutes of standing on that platform, her cries had shifted from ordinary fussing to something more urgent, a thin, high, almost desperate sound that cut straight through Naomi's coat. "I know," Naomi told her. "I know. We're going." She pulled Emma tighter against her body, picked up the carpet bag, and walked into Iron Ridge. It wasn't much of a town, a main street of maybe 8 or 9 buildings, most of them dark, a livery stable with a light burning in the back, a saloon called the Copper Nail, from which music occasionally drifted, muffled by the storm. The dry goods store had a lamp in the window, and Naomi could make out a woman's silhouette moving around behind the glass. She pushed inside. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she nearly sagged with relief. Emma went quiet almost immediately, turning her head toward the heat of the wood stove in the corner. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and had settled into something harder over the years. She looked up from the ledger she was working on and studied Naomi without saying anything. "I'm sorry to bother you," Naomi said. "The station master mentioned you might have a room available." "I might." The woman set down her pen. "You come in on the evening train?" "Yes, ma'am. There's been a mistake with my ticket. I was meant to travel to Harlan's Crossing. I'll need to wait until a connection is available." The woman's eyes went to Emma, who was still pressed against Naomi's shoulder, fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. "That your baby?" "Yes." "She's sick?" "She's cold. She'll be fine once she's warm." The woman was quiet for a moment. "It's 50 cents a night. I don't cook for guests, and I don't allow men in the room after 8 in the evening." "That's fine. Naomi stopped. She did the arithmetic in her head and it came out badly. She had 63 cents in her purse. "I may need to send a telegram to arrange funds from the man I'm traveling to meet. His name is Victor Ashford. He has a ranch outside Harlan's Crossing. Perhaps you've heard of him?" The woman's expression shifted slightly, though Naomi couldn't read it well enough to know what it meant. "Can't say I have. If I could send the telegram tonight, I'm sure he'd wire money within a day or two. In the meantime, I could offer you—" "I don't run credit," the woman said. "I'm sorry. I truly am. But I can't run a boarding house on promises, you understand. I've been burned before." "I have 60 cents, Naomi said quietly. It was nearly everything she had. "Would that cover tonight?" The woman looked at her for a long moment, and Naomi thought she saw something working behind those careful eyes. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more like a person trying to decide how much trouble they were willing to accept. "Let me see your ticket," she said finally. Naomi set the carpet bag down and opened her coat enough to reach the inner pocket where she kept her documents. She found the money order, Victor's last letter, Emma's birth certificate, and nothing else. She checked again. Then she checked the outer pockets of her coat and the top section of the bag. Her hands had gone cold again despite the warmth of the store. "It's not here," she said. "Your ticket." "It was—" "I had it when I boarded. I showed it to the conductor." She looked up, and she knew her face was giving her away, that the particular kind of panic only a person who has very little left to lose can feel. "I must have dropped it on the train when I was gathering Emma and the bag. Without a ticket, you've got no proof of where you were headed," the woman said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was definite. "I'm sorry. I can't take in a stranger with an infant and no money and no papers. I've got my own livelihood to think about." "Please," Naomi said it quietly. She wasn't the kind of woman who begged easily. She'd learned early that begging rarely helped and cost something besides. But Emma was starting to shiver again, even in the warmth of the store, and Thursday was 4 days away, and the snow outside was not stopping. "Just for tonight, the baby—" "I'm sorry," Mrs. Holt said again, and picked up her pen. What? She tried the saloon next, not because she expected anything from it, but because the light was on and it was warm and she'd run out of other options. She pushed through the door and stood just inside the threshold, Emma against her chest, snow dripping from her coat onto the plank floor. 6 or 7 men looked up from their drinks. The barkeep, a young man with red hair and an expression of permanent mild surprise, set down the glass he was wiping. "I need somewhere to stay tonight," Naomi said. She kept her voice even. "Or at least a place out of the cold for a few hours. I'm willing to work for it. I can cook, I can clean, I can—" "We don't take in strays," said one of the men at the bar. He wasn't being vicious about it, just matter-of-fact, which was somehow worse. "She's got a baby," said someone else, and Naomi couldn't tell from the voice whether that was meant in her favor or against her. "That's exactly the problem," said the first man. "I have a sick child," Naomi said, and Emma, as if on cue, began to cry again. Not dramatically, but steadily, the hopeless kind of crying that comes from being cold and hungry and not understanding why the world is what it is. "Please, I am not asking for charity. I will work every minute she sleeps." The barkeep looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I can't. The owner doesn't allow—" "I know," Naomi said. "I know." She went back out into the snow. She walked the length of the main street one more time, trying every door that had a light behind it. The feed store, the land office, which was locked, a house at the end of the block where a woman answered the door with a child on her hip and took one look at Naomi and said, "I can't help you," before closing it again. The snow was coming harder. Naomi had stopped feeling her feet somewhere in the last half hour, and Emma's crying had gone quiet in a way that worried her more than the crying had. Quiet wasn't better. Quiet in the cold meant the baby was using everything she had just to hold on. Naomi stopped walking. She was in the middle of the street, between one pool of lamplight and the next, and for a moment she just stood there with her daughter pressed against her and let herself feel how bad this actually was. Not to wallow in it, she didn't have the time for that, but because she needed to be accurate about their situation in order to survive it. And their situation was, she had no shelter, no money, no ticket, no one who knew her name in this town, and the temperature was still dropping. She shifted Emma higher on her hip, turned, and walked toward the livery stable. It was the last building she hadn't tried. The light inside was from a lantern hung on an iron hook, and it lit the space in long amber angles. It smelled of horses and hay and manure and something else underneath. The organic living warmth of large animals at rest. There were 4 horses in stalls along the left wall. A work table ran along the right, covered in tools and harness leather and the organized clutter of a man who worked with his hands. He was at the far end, crouched next to one of the horses, running his hands along her leg with the focused concentration of a man diagnosing something. He didn't hear Naomi come in over the wind. She stood for a moment, then said, "Excuse me." He looked up. He was maybe 35, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. Not just tanned, but marked by it. The kind of face that had been through seasons. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that was in need of a shave by several days. His eyes, catching the lantern light, were a pale gray-brown that Naomi had no good name for. He looked at her and at Emma without surprise, though she was clearly not what he'd expected to see. "Storm got you?" he said. "The train put me off at the wrong stop," she said. "I've been trying to find somewhere to get the baby out of the cold. I've tried everywhere else in town." She didn't say please. She was tired of saying please. "I don't have money for a room. I lost my ticket on the train. I have a healthy baby who will not be healthy much longer if she spends another hour in this cold. And I'm telling you honestly that I don't know what else to do." He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on the rag tucked through his belt. He looked at Emma for a long moment. Emma looked back at him with the grave, evaluating expression she had when she was uncertain about something. "My name's Silas Boone," he said. "I've got a ranch 1/4 mile east of town. Nothing fancy, but it's warm." Naomi stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know what cold does to a baby." He picked up the lantern from its hook. "You coming?" "Omatsom." "Isas." She almost said no. Even then, standing in a livery stable in a blizzard with a shivering infant and not a coin to her name, some stubborn part of her brain cataloged the ways this could go wrong. A strange man. A ranch outside of town. No one who knew her was anywhere in this part of the country. But Emma's breath against her neck had gone shallow, and the walk from the main street to the stable had taken the last of whatever reserve Naomi had been drawing on, and so she said, "Yes, thank you," and followed him out into the storm. The ranch was exactly as he described it, nothing fancy. A low-roofed cabin with a barn behind it, a fence line barely visible through the snow. The kind of place that had been built for function rather than appearance, and had been living by that principle for some years without much argument. Inside was better. A fireplace large enough to actually heat the room, with coals still glowing from the morning's fire. A table, 2 chairs, a cot along one wall, and a closed door that presumably led to a bedroom. Cast iron pots on the stove shelf. Shelves of canned goods and flour sacks. Everything was clean, she noticed, but bare. The kind of clean that happens when there's nobody to make a mess. Not because anyone is particularly neat. Silas built up the fire without being asked. He didn't fuss over it or talk about it, just moved the way people move when they know a task by heart. Naomi set Emma down on the cot and unwrapped her from the outer layers, checking her the way she'd been checking her all evening. Hands, feet, the color of her lips. Emma blinked up at her, slow and heavy-eyed. "She warm enough?" Silas asked from across the room. He was still by the fire, giving them space. Getting there, Naomi pulled off her own coat and wrapped it around Emma as an extra layer. "She'll be all right once she's had something warm." She hesitated. "I'm nursing, but I haven't eaten since morning, and I don't know if that affects—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. You didn't need to know that." "There's stew from last night on the shelf," he said. "Takes about 10 minutes on the stove." "I can make it," she said, and stood. "I didn't say you couldn't." but he was already moving toward the stove. They worked around each other in the small kitchen space without getting in each other's way, which surprised her. The stew heated quickly, and it was better than expected. Venison, she thought, with turnips and something herbed. She ate standing up, one eye on Emma, and felt the warmth of it move through her like something being restored. Silas sat at the table with his own bowl and didn't ask her anything. Not where she was going, not who she was going to meet, not what had happened with the ticket or the train. He just ate, and she was more grateful for the silence than she could have explained. Emma fell asleep within 20 minutes of being warm and fed, her little chest rising and falling with the easy, deep rhythm of a child who has decided the crisis is over. Naomi sat on the edge of the cot and watched her and breathed. "I'll sleep on the floor," she said finally, "if you have a blanket. I've got two. Take one for yourself." He nodded at the door on the other side of the room. "I'll take the bedroom." "Mr. Boone?" She looked up at him. "Why did you help us?" He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not the quick reassuring answer most people give when they've done something kind and want to dismiss the question. "My wife died 3 years back," he said. "In November. It was a hard winter." He picked up his bowl and carried it to the wash basin. "Anyway, you'll want to send that telegram tomorrow, first thing." He went into the bedroom and closed the door, and Naomi sat in the firelight with her sleeping daughter and tried to figure out what she felt. Not safe, exactly. That would have been too simple. She felt the particular, precarious gratitude of someone who has been pulled back from an edge and knows that the edge is still right there, that the next wrong step is still possible, that a stranger's kindness is not the same thing as solid ground. But Emma was warm, and there was a blanket and a fire, and for tonight, that was going to have to be enough. Outside, the blizzard kept going. Iron Ridge pulled its shutters tight and went to sleep around them, indifferent as it had always been, not knowing or caring about the woman and the baby who had arrived in the wrong place on the wrong night and were, by the thinnest margin possible, still here. Naomi lay down on the floor beside the cot. She listened to her daughter breathe. She thought about Victor Ashford's letters, folded in her bag, the careful handwriting, the measured words, the promise he had made to a woman he'd never met. She thought about Thursday. She thought about the way Silas Boone had said anyway, and closed the door, like he'd started to say something about his wife and changed his mind. She told herself to sleep. She told herself tomorrow would be better, that she'd send the telegram and Victor would wire money, and the whole terrible mistake would get untangled and life would correct itself back toward the plan she'd made. She believed most of that when she fell asleep. The telegram went out Tuesday morning. Naomi walked into town before 8. Emma bundled against her chest in a shawl she'd knotted the way her mother had taught her, tight across the back, looped under both arms, so her hands were free. The storm had spent itself overnight and left Iron Ridge buried in the particular silence that deep snow makes, that thick, muffled quiet, where even footsteps seem to disappear before they land. The sky had gone pale and flat, the color of old bone, and the cold had the dry, biting quality that follows a blizzard when the wind is gone and nothing moves. The telegraph office shared a wall with the post office, operated by a man named Crail, who wore the same suspicious expression regardless of who he was talking to. He took down the message she dictated word by word. Her name, her situation, her location, the request for funds to be wired and confirmation of the arrangement, and read it back to her twice, slowly, as if she might be confused about what she'd said. "That'll be 12 cents, he told her. She paid it. She had 51 cents left. "How long for a reply?" "Depends where it's going. Harlan's Crossing. Could be today, could be tomorrow." She thanked him and went back out into the cold. Silas was in the barn when she returned, working on something she couldn't see from the doorway, his back to her. She'd left that morning while he was still inside, and hadn't properly thought through what it would feel like to come back to a stranger's home with no news, no money, and no clear sense of when either of those things would change. She stood at the barn door for a moment, Emma shifting against her chest. "Telegram sent," she said. He turned. He had a piece of harness leather in his hands, half mended. "Any reply?" "Not yet. Could be today." She paused. "I'd like to earn my keep while I wait, if you'll let me." He looked at her steadily. He had a way of looking at people. Not cold, not warm exactly, but thorough. like he was taking in more than most people bothered to. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know that." She met his eyes. "I'm not offering because I owe you. I'm offering because I don't know how to sit still in someone else's house and wait." He considered this for a second, then nodded once and went back to the harness. Oh, she started in the kitchen because that was where she knew the most and because it needed it the most. Not dirty. She'd been right about that the night before. Silas kept things clean. But neglected in the way a space gets when its purpose has narrowed down to utility and nothing else. The shelves held canned goods and staple flour and salt and a small jar of dried herbs she had to smell to identify because the label had rubbed off. There were 2 cast iron pans, a good Dutch oven, a coffee pot with a crack in the handle that someone had never gotten around to replacing, a tin of molasses, nearly empty, enough dried beans to feed a family for 2 weeks, but only if someone was paying attention. She found the gaps and started filling them mentally, the way you take stock of something when you're figuring out what can be done with what exists rather than what you wish existed. Emma spent the morning on a folded blanket on the floor near the stove, close enough to the warmth to be content, far enough that Naomi wasn't anxious. Emma was the kind of baby who could entertain herself for stretches at a time. She'd pick up whatever was within reach and examine it with complete seriousness, turn it over, put it in her mouth, discard it, find something else. A wooden spoon kept her occupied for the better part of an hour. Naomi worked around her, listening to the small sounds she made, feeling the ordinary anchoring rhythm of caring for someone who needed her. By mid-morning, she had a proper stock going on the back of the stove. Water, a handful of the dried beans set to soak, the onion she'd found in the cellar under the floorboard that she'd thought was a root cellar for storage. She'd found more than she expected down there. 2 jars of preserved tomatoes, a crock of salt pork, a string of dried peppers, half a sack of cornmeal. Someone had put those up at some point, or Silas had bought them and not touched them. She was pulling together something that might be cornbread by noon when she heard Silas come through the back door. He stopped when he saw what was on the stove. She kept her eyes on the bread she was turning in the pan and waited. "I didn't ask you to do all that," he said. "You didn't tell me not to," she said, "and I found everything in your own cellar." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the wash basin and started cleaning his hands. "What is it?" "Bean soup, if you've got the patience. Cornbread now." She glanced at him. "Are you allergic to anything?" "Not that I know of." "Good." She put the cornbread in front of him when it was done, still warm, with a slick of the salt pork drippings she'd saved from the pan. He sat at the table and ate it without ceremony, the way a man eats who has spent years eating alone. No comment on it, just eating. But he had a second piece, and she noticed that. The reply from Victor Ashford did not come that day. It didn't come Wednesday either. Naomi went to the telegraph office each morning and each afternoon and stood at the counter while Crail checked his box and shook his head. She kept her expression level during these visits, but by Wednesday afternoon, walking back to Silas's ranch in the fading light with Emma on her hip and nothing to show for it, the level expression was costing her something. She told herself there were explanations. The telegraph lines went down in storms. Victor might not have been in town to receive the message. The operator at Harlan's Crossing might be slow. She went through each one carefully, like a woman checking the load-bearing quality of each board on a bridge she has to cross. On Wednesday evening, after Emma was asleep, she sat at the table with the oil lamp and took out Victor's letters and read them again. They were sensible letters, businesslike, in a way she'd initially taken for efficiency and was now rereading for other qualities. He'd addressed her needs practically: the arrangement, the ranch, what he expected of a wife, what he'd provide in return. He'd mentioned Emma in the second letter, briefly, in a way that said he'd accept the child as a condition of the arrangement without saying much more than that. She told herself at the time that a man who would accept another man's child was a good man. She was still telling herself that. But she was reading the letters differently now. She heard Silas come out of the bedroom. He moved quietly for a large man. He went to the stove and poured himself a cup of whatever was left of the morning's coffee, which by then would have been approximately the texture of tar, and stood by the window drinking it. "You're reading those again," he said. He wasn't asking. "Trying to figure out if I've missed something. Have you?" She folded the letters. "I don't know yet." He didn't press it. He came and sat at the other chair with his awful coffee and was quiet for a moment. "You said he knew about Emma," Silas said, "before you left." "Yes. I told him in my first letter. He replied that it was fine." She smoothed the folded edge of the top letter with her thumb. "He said he understood the situation." "What situation?" She looked up. "My husband died 14 months ago, before Emma was born." She said it the way she'd gotten used to saying it, directly, without a long pause before or after, because the pause invited a kind of sympathy she found hard to absorb in small spaces. "We were on a farm in Ohio. It wasn't a good year. After he was gone, I couldn't. There wasn't enough to hold on to." I answered the advertisement. Silas turned his cup in his hands. "And before that? Before the farm? Before all of it?" She thought about it. "I taught school for 3 years. In Indiana. I was good at it." She said the last part without bragging, just factual. "I didn't stop because I wanted to." He nodded slowly. He didn't fill the silence with anything, which she'd come to understand was characteristic of him. He wasn't uncomfortable with quiet the way some people were, the kind of people who say something, anything, just to avoid it. Silas Boone seemed to consider silence a perfectly adequate response to most things. "Your wife," Naomi said. She hadn't planned to ask, but it came out anyway. "You mentioned her the first night, that she died in November." He was still for a moment. 3 years ago. "What was her name?" "Clara." He said it without flinching, which told her something. A man still raw about it would have either avoided the name or said it with too much weight. He said it the way you say the name of someone you've had time to grieve properly. Still there. Still real, but not a wound anymore. Just a truth. She was a better rancher than me, honestly. She knew this land. "What happened?" "Fever. Came on fast." He took a drink of the terrible coffee. "I got the doctor out from Millhaven, but it was 3 days by the time he made it. By then..." He stopped. "Anyway," that word again. "Anyway." She'd noticed it was the word he used when he'd gotten closer to something than he meant to and was pulling back. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No." A pause. "We wanted them. It just didn't happen." He stood and carried his cup back to the shelf, rinsed it at the wash basin. "You should sleep. Emma'll be up early." "She's always up early," Naomi said, which was true, and which made something shift in his face that she might have called the beginning of a smile in different lighting. She put the letters away and lay down on the floor by the cot where Emma slept, and stared at the low ceiling and thought about a woman named Clara who had known this land, and a man who used the word anyway when he was closing a door on something. Wound. Thursday came and went with no word from Victor Ashford. By Friday, Naomi had stopped making the afternoon trip to the telegraph office and went only in the morning because the twice-daily trips were beginning to feel less like checking for news and more like a demonstration of hope she wasn't sure she still had. She put the energy somewhere more useful. The cabin's east-facing window had a gap between the frame and the log wall where the chinking had dried out and crumbled. She found a bucket of the mix in the barn. Silas used it for the barn repairs she'd seen it, and spent part of Friday morning carefully refilling the gap while Emma napped. It was awkward work with cold fingers, and she made a mess of the sill before she got the consistency right. But when she was done, the draft that had been threading through that corner of the room every morning was gone. Silas noticed it that evening. He ran his thumb along the repaired line without saying anything, then looked at her. "The chinking mix was in the barn," she said. "I hope that was all right." "I've been meaning to do that since October," he said. "I had time." He looked like he was going to say something and then didn't, which she was also beginning to understand was characteristic of him. He had thoughts he kept. She didn't know yet whether that was just his nature or whether there were specific things he was thinking that he'd decided she didn't need to know. Saturday, she mended 3 shirts she'd found folded on the bedroom shelf. She'd asked before taking them, knocking on the frame of the open bedroom door and explaining what she'd noticed. He'd shrugged in a way that meant yes, using thread from her bag and small, tight stitches that would hold longer than whatever had been there before. She worked by the lamp in the evenings after Emma slept, and the rhythm of it was something she hadn't known she needed. The ordinary, narrow focus of needle and thread, the measurable progress, the small, completed thing. He came in one evening and found her at it. He stopped in the doorway for a second. You don't have to do that, he said. Silas. She looked up. She'd started using his first name sometime on Thursday without consciously deciding to. Stop telling me I don't have to do things. Something crossed his face. It might have been amusement. All right, he said, and went to the stove. Look, Emma, for her part, had opinions about Silas Boone. She'd been wary of him the first day, watching him from Naomi's arms with the focused, anxious attention of a baby who has decided that this new large person requires evaluation. By the second day, she'd moved to curious, tracking him around the room with her eyes whenever he came inside, twisting in Naomi's hold to keep him in sight. By Thursday, he was fully acceptable, which Emma communicated by reaching for him. Naomi had been across the room when it happened. Silas had come in from the barn and crouched down to his boots, and Emma, who had been sitting on the blanket nearby, had simply reached out and grabbed his finger. He'd gone very still. Naomi watched from the corner of her eye, not wanting to make it into something by staring directly at it. Emma held his finger and looked up at him with tremendous seriousness. Silas looked back. He said nothing for a moment, and then very quietly he said, "Hey there." Emma considered this greeting, found it satisfactory, and put his finger in her mouth. "Emma," Naomi said. "She's all right," Silas said quickly. And then he sat down on the floor, just sat, right there on the cabin floor in his barn coat, and let Emma do whatever she was going to do, which turned out to be climbing partially up his arm and laughing at herself for it. Naomi had heard Emma laugh before, obviously. She was 8 months old and had been laughing for a couple of months. But there was something about hearing it in the specific quiet of that cabin, after the blizzard, after the cold, after the rejections and the missing ticket and the silence from Victor Ashford, that made it land differently, like a sound that belonged somewhere it hadn't been before. She turned back to the stove before Silas could catch her expression. The gossip started, as it always does, before anyone had any real information to work with. Naomi became aware of it Monday of the following week, when she walked Emma to town for the morning telegraph check, and a woman named Patrice Dunham, who ran the dressmaking shop on the east end of the main street, stopped her in front of the dry goods store. "Mrs. Carter," Patrice said, with a smile that was doing too much work. "Still here, I see. Still waiting on this connection," Naomi said pleasantly. Patrice glanced at Emma. "And you've been staying out at the Boone place this whole time." It wasn't a question exactly. It had the shape of a question, but the quality of something else. "Mr. Boone was kind enough to offer shelter when the hotel was full," Naomi said. The hotel had not been full, but she saw no reason to give Patrice Dunham more to work with than she already had. "Of course," Patrice said, in the tone of someone who does not mean of course at all. "He's a good man, Silas. It's just—" She smiled again. "Well, people do talk." "People can talk about whatever they like," Naomi said, keeping her voice warm. "Excuse me." She was careful not to hurry away because hurrying would have confirmed something. When she got to the telegraph office, Crail handed her an envelope with the expression of a man who had been waiting to see what she would do with its contents. She took it to the bench outside and sat with Emma in her lap and opened it. The telegram was from a man named Hollis, who identified himself as Victor Ashford's foreman. It said that Mr. Ashford had received her message. It said that Mr. Ashford was attempting to verify the circumstances before taking action. It said that the matter of the ticket would need to be resolved, as the funds represented a significant sum, and Mr. Ashford wanted to ensure there was no misunderstanding. That was all it said. Naomi read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and sat for a moment with Emma against her, watching the main street of Iron Ridge go about its business in the pale winter light. She thought about the word misunderstanding. She thought about Victor Ashford's foreman writing a telegram on his behalf rather than Victor writing one himself. She thought about the phrase attempting to verify the circumstances, which could mean a man being careful or could mean something else entirely, and she wasn't sure yet which it was. Emma grabbed a handful of Naomi's coat collar and pulled at it experimentally. "I know," Naomi said. "I know." She didn't tell Silas about the telegram right away. She was still working out what she thought about it herself. What she did that week was what she'd been doing the week before, only more so, because movement was what she knew how to do when she was trying to think. She organized the root cellar, which was a chaos of loose jars and half-empty sacks with no system. She devised one, preserved goods on the left shelf by type, staples on the right by how often they'd be needed, the crock of salt pork in the far corner where it was coolest. It took an afternoon and it made her back hurt, and when she was done, she felt the particular satisfaction of a small, ignored problem that was now no longer a problem. She found a stack of window curtains in a box under the cot. Clara's probably, she guessed from the way they were folded, and spent an evening shaking them out and checking for damage. 2 of the 3 panels were fine. The third had a water stain at the corner that didn't wash out entirely, but she hung it on the north window where the stain would face outward, and you'd only see it if you were looking for it. When Silas came in that evening and saw the curtains, he stopped walking. She'd been expecting this and watched him carefully. She hadn't asked about hanging them. She'd told herself that if they were a problem, she would take them down. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, looking at the windows, and she could see him working through something. Whatever it was, he got to the other side of it. "They were in the box under the cot," she said. "I thought, if it's all right." "It's fine," he said. They're fine." He cleared his throat and went to the stove. She let it go. The second week she started on the barn. This was not the arrangement exactly. She'd been thinking of her contributions as domestic, as the things she knew how to do in an interior space, because that felt like appropriate gratitude without overstepping. But she'd noticed the barn the way you notice a problem you're not sure is yours to fix. And one morning when Silas was out checking fence lines and Emma was sleeping, she went and stood in the barn doorway and looked at it honestly. The space itself was solid. Silas kept it clean, and the structure was sound. But there was a system problem. Tools hung wherever they'd last been used rather than where they lived, which meant half the time was spent looking for things. The grain situation was disorganized in a way that was going to matter when they got further into winter. The horse blankets were stored damp, which wouldn't help anyone. She started with the horse blankets because that one had a simple solution. She hung them on the south-facing fence line on a clear morning and let the winter sun do the work. Then she went back inside. When Silas came back that afternoon and found her reorganizing the tool wall, he stood in the barn doorway for a long moment. "What are you doing?" he said. Not with anger exactly, but with the specific tone of a man who has a system that doesn't look like a system to other people but makes sense to him. "Putting like things together," she said. "If you hate it, I'll put it back. I have a system." "I know." I tried to understand it for about 20 minutes before I gave up. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Where does this draw knife live?" He took a breath, then came and stood next to her and pointed to the second peg from the left. She hung it there. They worked in silence for a while, him pointing, her placing. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was functional, which was close enough. "The grain sacks need consolidating," she said after a while. "I know. I wasn't telling you. I was thinking out loud." "I know," he said again, and she could hear that it wasn't dismissive. He was just locating himself in the conversation. She looked at him sideways. "Do you always know things?" "No," he said, and there was something wry in it that surprised her. "I knew where the draw knife went. That's about the limit of my expertise today." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling and turned back to the tool wall. By the end of the second week, the ranch had changed in ways that were subtle and hard to describe. Not transformed. Nothing so dramatic. The curtains in the windows, the organized root cellar, the tool wall in the barn. The stove had hot food on it at regular hours. Emma's blanket was in a corner of the main room now, a designated territory, with her wooden spoon and the smooth river rock she'd adopted as a toy, and the small ragdoll Naomi had stitched together from scraps. It was livable. It was more than livable. It had begun, almost without anyone meaning it to feel like somewhere people actually lived. Silas didn't say anything about this directly, but she noticed things. He started coming inside a few minutes earlier in the evenings. He'd started making a second cup of coffee in the mornings and setting it on the counter before he went out, without being asked and without saying anything about it. And she'd started drinking it without acknowledging it either, because acknowledging it would have made it into something neither of them had decided to make it into yet. He started talking to Emma when he came in. Not long conversations. Silas was not a man who had long conversations with anyone, but small ones, the kind people have with babies when they're not really thinking about it. "How's your day been? What'd you find today?" Emma received these greetings with her characteristic gravity and then produced whatever object she was currently holding as if in answer. One evening, Naomi came in from the porch, where she'd been shaking out a mat, and found Silas sitting cross-legged on the cabin floor with Emma in his lap, both of them examining a dry bean he'd apparently gotten from the jar on the shelf. Emma had it in her fist and was looking at it. Silas was watching her with an expression Naomi had not seen on his face before. Something quiet and almost wondering, like a man looking at something ordinary and being surprised by what he finds in it. He didn't notice Naomi standing in the doorway, so she had a second to see his face without him composing it. She went back outside and stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. The sun was going down behind the ridge, painting the snow in shades of orange and gray. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote was testing its voice. She thought, "This is not what I planned." She thought, "Emma is laughing more than she has since Ohio." She thought, "Victor Ashford has not sent another telegram." She showed Silas the telegram from Hollis that evening, after Emma was asleep. She'd been carrying it for 4 days, and she was tired of carrying it alone. He read it at the table, holding it carefully by the edges the way people handle paper they know is important to someone else. Attempting to verify the circumstances, he read aloud flatly. "Yes." He sent his foreman. "Yes." Silas set the telegram on the table. He looked at it for a moment. "Have you replied?" "Not yet." She paused. "I've been thinking about what to say." He was quiet, which meant he was thinking too. "You need more money wired," he said. "Whatever else is going on, you need funds to get yourself to Harlan's Crossing when the next connection comes through." He looked up. "What do you have left?" She told him. He didn't react to the number, which was considerate of him, because it was not a number that warranted a calm reaction. "I can advance you what you need," he said, "for the ticket." She looked at him. "Silas? I'm not lending it to you because I want you to stay," he said quietly, and there was a precision to the way he said it that made her understand he'd thought about how it might sound and wanted to be clear. "I'm lending it because you're stuck and you shouldn't be. Whatever you decide to do." He met her eyes. "Whatever you decide." She looked down at the table. She felt the kindness of it like pressure on a bruise. Not painful exactly, but tender. Something that told her where the sore place was. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. You might decide you don't want it." She looked up at that, but he was already standing, carrying his coffee cup to the wash basin, and his back was to her. She sent a reply to Hollis the next morning. Courteous, factual, specific. She listed the date she had received her ticket, the junction at Millhaven, the conductor, the platform at Iron Ridge. Her arrival time. She listed what she'd done since, the telegram sent, the dates she'd checked for reply. She included the money she still had and the expenses she'd incurred. She noted that she understood the situation must appear irregular and that she was prepared to provide any documentation available to her. She did not apologize. She had nothing to apologize for. She walked back to the ranch in the brittle morning cold, Emma watching the sky from the wrap at her chest. The sun was up, but not warm yet, the kind of winter light that illuminates without thawing. She was thinking about Victor Ashford's letters again, the careful handwriting, the word understand. She was thinking about what it meant that he'd said he understood, and then, when she'd needed that understanding to do something, had sent his foreman instead. She didn't have a conclusion yet. She had a feeling, the kind that lives below the thinking level, in the body, where you know something before you can say it. She walked past the barn and heard Emma make a small please sound and looked up to find that Silas had come out and was standing in the barn doorway in his coat, watching them come up the path. He didn't say anything. He didn't wave. He just stood there for a second and then went back inside. But he'd been watching for them. She hadn't missed that. She walked the last stretch to the cabin door and went inside to start the morning coffee, and tried not to think too specifically about what that meant, or what she wanted it to mean, because there was still a telegram she hadn't received, and a man whose letters she hadn't returned, and a train to Harlan's Crossing that ran on Thursdays, weather permitting. She poured water into the coffee pot and set it on the stove, and listened to the ordinary sounds of the ranch morning coming through the walls, and told herself she was still here because of a ticketing mistake and a blizzard. She told herself that for a little while longer. The second reply from Harlan's Crossing came on a Wednesday, 9 days after Naomi had sent her detailed accounting. She was in the barn when Silas came back from town with the mail. She'd stopped going herself after Patrice Dunham had begun making a point of being on the main street whenever Naomi passed, which was probably coincidence, but felt like something else. Silas set the envelope on the table without comment and went to wash up, giving her the room. She opened it at the table with Emma on her knee. It was from Victor Ashford himself this time. 3 paragraphs, in the same careful handwriting she recognized from his letters. The first paragraph acknowledged receipt of her accounting. The second said he had spoken with the railroad office at Mill Haven and been informed that no ticketing error had been recorded for that journey and that the conductor she referenced had not been working that line on the date in question. The third paragraph said he was willing to proceed with the original arrangement, but that given the irregularities, he would need her to present herself at Harlan's Crossing within the week, and that any further delay would require him to reconsider the terms. No mention of Emma. No question about whether they were well. No acknowledgement that she had been stranded in a blizzard with an infant. Naomi read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down on the table and sat with her hand flat on the wood beside it for a moment. "What does he say?" Silas asked from the other side of the room. He'd finished washing and was standing by the stove with a careful kind of stillness, not looking at her. She told him, not reading it aloud, just summarizing, her voice level. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a count of several seconds. "The conductor wasn't on that line," he said. "That's what he was told. Railroads don't always keep clean records, especially in winter, when half the routes are running irregular." "I know that." "He doesn't know that," Silas said, and there was something in his voice, not anger, not yet, but the careful flatness of a man keeping something in check. Naomi looked at the letter again. "He wants me there by next Wednesday." "That's the Thursday connection," Silas said. "You'd have to leave tomorrow." The room was quiet except for Emma, who had gotten hold of Naomi's braid and was pulling it experimentally, the way she did when she was bored and wanted a reaction. Naomi reached up and disentangled her fingers gently. "I know," Naomi said. She didn't say anything else. Neither did Silas. The fire popped in the stove, and Emma made a small, dissatisfied sound at having her entertainment removed. And outside, the wind was starting up again, the particular dry rattle of it that came before a temperature drop. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay on her floor blanket in the firelight and ran the arithmetic of her situation, the way she'd gotten into the habit of doing when things were uncertain. Not catastrophizing, just counting. She had what Silas had offered to lend her, which was enough for the ticket to Harlan's Crossing. She had Victor's letter, which was not warm but was technically still an offer. She had Emma, who was 8 months old and sleeping peacefully 6 inches above Naomi's head, with no opinion about any of it. What she didn't have was the missing ticket, which was the one thing that would have settled the question of what had happened at Millhaven Junction cleanly and irrevocably. Without it, she had her word against the railroad's records, and she already knew which one of those was going to win in a room with Victor Ashford. She thought about the conductor. He'd been an older man, she remembered now, or middle-aged, it was hard to say. She'd been managing Emma and the bag and had only really registered his face in the way you register faces when you're distracted. He'd been certain about the stop. She'd asked twice. Had she asked twice? She had. She was sure of that. She turned over and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the ranch. She thought about the curtains and the windows, and the organized root cellar, and the way the cabin had started to sound different in the last 2 weeks. Less like a space where one person was enduring, and more like a place where more than one person was living. She thought about Emma in Silas's lap, examining the dry bean. She told herself she was not making this decision based on those things. She told herself she was being practical, that she was thinking about the ticket and the conductor and the railroad records and what Thursday's train actually meant for her and her daughter. She fell asleep sometime around 2 in the morning without having decided anything, which was its own kind of answer. The next 4 days proceeded quietly, the way the days before a storm often do. Naomi wrote a reply to Victor Ashford. She told him she would make every effort to arrive by Wednesday. She did not say she was coming. She did not say she wasn't. She chose her words the way she'd chosen them for the letter about the ticket. Carefully, with precision, saying exactly what was true and nothing beyond it. She sent it Thursday morning, which gave her the week to think. Silas did not ask her what she'd decided. She understood by now that this was not indifference. It was something closer to respect, the particular kind that leaves a person room to work something out without an audience. She'd known very few people like that in her life. Her mother hadn't been one. Her late husband Thomas had been better, but even he'd had a habit of asking, "What are you thinking?" when what he meant was, "Tell me so I can help fix it." Silas didn't ask and didn't try to fix it, and somehow that was more useful than either. What he did do on Friday morning was come in from the barn and set a small leather pouch on the table without preamble. "For the ticket," he said. "Whenever you need it." She looked at the pouch. She looked at him. "You said you weren't giving me that to make me stay," she said. "I'm not." "Because if you were—" "Naomi." He met her eyes, and she saw that he meant it, that whatever he was offering was genuinely without that particular string attached. "I know." She left the pouch on the table and didn't pick it up and didn't refuse it, and he went back outside, and that was where things stood. The storm came in on Sunday night. She heard it start while Emma was nursing, a low sound at first like the house settling, and then the wind picked up, and it was unmistakably the real thing. Not a quick blow, but the steady, committed howl of a storm that had decided to stay. By the time she put Emma down for the night, snow was hitting the cabin walls in sheets, and the temperature had dropped enough that she could feel it through the floor when she walked barefoot to the stove. She built the fire up and went to bed. Emma woke at 2, which was normal. Naomi reached up to the cot in the half-dark, still more asleep than awake, and found her. Emma was hot. Not warm the way babies are warm when they've been sleeping under a blanket. Hot in the different way, the way that announces itself in your palm before your brain has finished processing what it means. Naomi sat up and gathered Emma against her chest, and the baby didn't settle the way she usually did. She fussed, turned her head side to side, made a thin, unhappy sound. Naomi pressed her lips to Emma's forehead. The heat was unmistakable. "Okay," she said, to herself or to Emma or to the room. She stood up. She worked by firelight and instinct, doing what she knew. Cool cloth on the forehead changed when it warmed. Emma at her breast, which she didn't want, but Naomi persisted. She walked her, because motion sometimes helped, pacing the small length of the cabin in the dark while the storm threw itself against the walls outside. By 3 in the morning, Emma's temperature hadn't broken and her breathing had gotten rapid. Not distressed yet, but faster than it should have been, the kind of small change that only a mother counts. Naomi knocked on the bedroom door. Silas answered it faster than a man should if he'd been asleep. She thought he probably hadn't been. "Emma has a fever," she said. "It came on fast. Her breathing is rapid." He took one look at her face, not the baby's face, hers, and was already pulling on his boots. "Nearest doctor's in Mill Haven," he said. That's 20 miles in a blizzard." "I know. I can try." "You'll kill a horse before you get halfway there." She said it evenly because they didn't have time for anything else. "Tell me what you have in the house." He crossed to the shelf where he kept his supplies. Not a doctor's kit, but what a working man keeps on a frontier ranch. A roll of cotton batting, turpentine, a tin of camphor salve, willow bark he'd had for his own aches, dried chamomile in a paper twist from last summer. She went through it with her hands while he held Emma. Emma screamed when Silas took her, the brief, outraged scream of a feverish baby removed from her mother, and then, unexpectedly, quieted. She pressed her hot forehead against his shoulder and lay there, heaving with the quick little breaths. Silas stood very still and held her and looked at Naomi. "Willow bark," she said. "I need to make a tea and I need water boiling. Steam will help her breathe." "How hot is she?" "Too hot." Naomi already had the pot filling at the water barrel. "I need you to keep holding her while I work." "I've got her." She worked fast. The willow bark tea was not a perfect medicine. She knew that, she wasn't naive, but she'd used it when Emma had been feverish at 4 months, and it had helped bring the temperature down. She steeped it longer than usual, until the water was a dark amber, and let it cool to lukewarm before coaxing Emma to take it. Emma resisted, turned her face away, fussed. Naomi persisted the way only mothers persist, patiently and without room for argument, until Emma had taken enough. She put the second pot on with the camphor and let it steam, and moved Emma's blanket and cot to the corner nearest the stove. "You should sleep," Naomi said to Silas, not because she believed he would, but because it was the right thing to say. "No," he said. Just that. She didn't argue. The night went on. Naomi had been through one bad night with Emma before, when she'd been 4 months old in Ohio, and Thomas had already been gone 2 months, and there'd been no one to sit up with her but Naomi herself. That night she had felt the particular terror of a woman entirely alone with a sick child. The terror that comes not just from the baby's danger, but from the knowledge that if you collapse, no one will catch you either. This night was different because Silas was there. He didn't try to take over. He didn't offer suggestions or second-guess her. He held Emma when she needed to be held and set her down when Naomi needed to treat her, and handed things without being asked for them because, after 2 weeks, he had learned roughly where everything was in his own house. He made coffee at 4 in the morning, which was practical, not because either of them was enjoying it, and set a cup on the shelf where Naomi could reach it when her hands were free. At one point around 4:30, Emma's breathing spiked. Not stopped, not in crisis, but the speed of it changed again, and Naomi sat down on the floor in front of the cot with her hand on Emma's chest and counted breaths for 30 seconds, and felt the specific quality of fear that she had no good vocabulary for. The fear a mother has when she is doing everything she knows and doesn't know if it's enough. Silas crouched beside her. He didn't say she'll be all right because he couldn't promise that, and she thought he understood it would have made it worse if he had. He just stayed there, close enough that his arm was against hers, and they both watched Emma's chest rise and fall. "The steam is helping," Naomi said. She needed to say something that was true and useful. "Her color's better than an hour ago." "Yeah," he said, "it is. The willow bark should start bringing the fever down within the hour if it's going to work." "Okay." "I need you to tell me if I'm wrong," she said. "If she looks worse to you, I need you to say it." He looked at her. "I don't know anything about babies," he said. "You know what wrong looks like," she said. "On a horse, on a person. You know what it looks like when something is going the wrong direction." He was quiet for a moment, studying Emma. "She doesn't look like she's going the wrong direction," he said carefully. "She looks like she's working hard, but not losing." Naomi looked at her daughter. The heaving little chest, the hot, flushed cheeks, the fingers curled loosely on the blanket. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She kept her hand on Emma's chest and counted. By 6 in the morning, the fever had dropped. Not gone, still present, still a concern, but down to something that felt less like emergency and more like ordinary sickness. Emma's breathing slowed. She fell into a deeper sleep, the kind of exhausted sleep that comes after a body has been fighting hard and has turned a corner. Naomi sat back from the cot and let herself breathe. She hadn't cried during the night. She hadn't had space for it. Now, sitting on the floor of the cabin in the early light with the storm still loud outside and her daughter's chest rising and falling in better rhythm, she felt the tears arrive without drama, not a breakdown but a leak. The slow release of something that had been held under pressure for 6 hours. She pressed her palms over her eyes and sat like that for a moment. Silas was at the table. He didn't make a sound, didn't say anything. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. "I need to check her again in an hour," she said. Her voice was rough. "I know," he said. "Sit down first." She didn't sit. She had too much adrenaline left, her body still running on the night's momentum. But she stood at the stove and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt the heat of it work through her palms and tried to let her shoulders drop. "Thank you," she said. "You did it," he said. "Not me." "You were here." She looked at him over the cup. He looked terrible. Unshaven, dark under the eyes. The particular ravaged quality of someone who has spent a night on the edge of something. She imagined she looked worse. "You being here mattered." He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that got too close to something he didn't know how to answer directly. She watched him for a moment and thought, not for the first time, that grief had done interesting things to this man. Not broken him, he was plainly not broken, but stripped him down to a core that was harder to obscure than most people's. "I was thinking," she said, and stopped. "About what?" "About how I've been telling myself I'm still here because of the train." She looked down at her coffee. "Because there's nothing else." He didn't respond immediately, which was his way. "And you're not sure that's the only reason," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I'm not sure of much this morning," she said honestly. "I'm tired and my daughter has a fever and I haven't eaten since yesterday noon." "I can fix one of those things," he said, and stood to go to the stove. She almost said only one, and stopped herself because she wasn't sure yet where the line was, and this morning was not the moment to find out. Emma slept most of the day. The storm didn't let up until early afternoon, and when it did, it left another 1.5 feet of new snow and the particular hushed aftermath that felt, after the long night, almost peaceful. Naomi checked Emma every hour on the hour, taking her temperature the only way she could, lips to forehead, the old measurement, the one that couldn't be wrong by much if you knew what you were feeling for. Each hour was a little better. By noon, Emma opened her eyes, looked at Naomi with the bleary, aggrieved expression of a baby who feels awful and wants someone to know about it, and then closed them again. By 2, she'd taken a full feeding, which was the clearest sign possible that the corner had been turned. Naomi sat beside the cot and let the relief come down over her like water. Silas brought food to her while she sat, bread and a bowl of something hot, set on the floor beside her without comment. She ate it without moving from Emma's side. He went back to the table and had his own, and they were quiet together for a long time. "She's stubborn," Naomi said eventually. "Takes after her mother," Silas said. Naomi looked up at him. He was looking at his bowl, apparently concentrating on it, but the corner of his mouth was doing something. "Was that a joke, Silas Boone?" she said. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. She looked back at Emma and felt something loosen in her chest that had been braced since the night before. Not happiness exactly. The night had been too close for that, and Emma was still sick, and the situation with Victor Ashford was still exactly what it was. But something that existed on the same spectrum. Something that involved a man she'd known less than 3 weeks making a quiet, deliberate joke while she sat on the floor of his cabin watching her daughter sleep off a fever. She thought, "I am in trouble here." She thought it clearly and without panic because she was too tired for panic, and because clarity, however inconvenient, was always better than the alternative. Emma was on the mend by Monday morning. Still pale, still sleeping more than usual, still clingy in the way of babies who have been sick and want the reassurance of their mother's body close, but eating and watching the room and making small sounds that were not the sounds of a sick baby, but the sounds of a recovering one. Naomi had just gotten her settled with the wooden spoon, still the favorite, when she heard the horses outside. More than one horse. She could tell from the sound the distinct pattern of multiple sets of hooves on the packed snow of the track to the ranch. She went to the window and looked. 2 horses. A man she didn't recognize on the first, heavy set, wearing a good coat and a hat that hadn't come cheap. A second man behind him with a badge on his coat that caught the flat winter light. The sheriff. She stood at the window for a moment, very still. Her mind ran through the possibilities the way it ran through arithmetic, quickly, looking for the answer before she'd finished setting up the problem. She came up with only one name. She went to the door and opened it before they reached the porch. The man in the good coat looked her over the way a man looks at something he's assessing for value. He was perhaps 50, heavy in the jaw and the chest, with small eyes that were presently arranged in an expression of controlled displeasure. He was not what she had pictured from the letters. The letters had been careful and neat. This man looked like a man who had other people be careful and neat on his behalf. "Mrs. Carter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Ashford," she said. He took his time looking at the cabin, at the door, at her. His eyes went to Emma, visible on the blanket behind Naomi, and then came back to Naomi's face without softening. "I received your letter," he said, "and I've ridden 3 hours in bad weather to resolve this situation in person, since letters don't seem to be moving things forward." "I appreciate that," she said. "Please come in out of the cold." She stepped back to make room and he came through the door, the sheriff behind him. The sheriff was younger, with an uncomfortable expression, the kind of man who is doing his job but would prefer to be elsewhere. Victor Ashford looked around the cabin. He took in the curtains and the windows, the organized shelves, Emma's corner with its blanket and toys, the coffee pot, the second cup on the counter. Something moved through his face. Not surprise exactly, but a calculation completing itself. "You've made yourself comfortable," he said. "I've been here 3 weeks," she said. "Through 2 blizzards and my daughter's fever." "Your daughter's fever?" He said it with a specific weight, like he was testing the word. "I wasn't informed of any fever." "You weren't informed because your last telegram was 11 days ago and contained no inquiry about her health." His expression tightened slightly. Mrs. Carter, I want to be reasonable about this. I'd welcome that, she said. The situation as I understand it, you received a ticket and a money order for travel to Harlan's Crossing. Instead of arriving, you ended up here. He gestured at the cabin. In another man's home. I was put off at the wrong station, she said. I've explained this. The railroad has no record of a ticketing error. The railroad has no record of the conductor who told me this was my stop either, because apparently he wasn't rostered on that route. She kept her voice even, which means either the railroad's records are wrong or I was put off by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Either way, the error wasn't mine. You have no ticket to prove what route you were on. I lost it gathering Emma when the conductor told us to disembark. I've explained this to your foreman and in 2 separate letters. Victor Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the sheriff. Then he looked around the cabin again, and she could see him assembling something in his mind, some architecture of interpretation that was not the same architecture as the truth. My money, he said. The funds I sent for your journey were spent on the journey. What remained, I've had to use for food and supplies these 3 weeks. I can account for every cent. You've spent my money, he said, in a tone that had dropped the careful register now, living in another man's house. I spent your money on food for Emma. She caught herself. For my daughter, who nearly died of fever 4 nights ago. That's a very convenient story, he said. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Naomi heard the back door open. She didn't turn to look, but she knew by the sound of the footsteps, the particular weight and rhythm of them on the cabin floor, who had just come in from the barn. Silas stopped inside the door. He took in the scene in one sweep, the man in the good coat, the sheriff. Naomi standing in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and her expression very controlled. Victor Ashford, Naomi said. This is Silas Boone. This is his ranch. Victor turned to look at Silas. Silas looked back at him without expression. Mr. Boone, Victor said. Mr. Ashford, Silas said. You've been sheltering this woman for 3 weeks. She arrived in a blizzard with a sick infant, Silas said. The temperature was dropping. I had a warm house. He didn't elaborate, and something about the economy of it made Victor's jaw tighten slightly. She was traveling to become my wife, Victor said. I know that. You've had another man's intended woman in your home for 3 weeks. A woman and her baby who had nowhere else to go, Silas said. His voice was perfectly flat, and Naomi understood that the flatness was not a lack of emotion, but a container for it. If that offends you, I'd suggest the weather take it up with the railroad. Victor's color had risen. He turned back to Naomi. Mrs. Carter, he said, and the courtesy had gone thin now, a surface with nothing much beneath it. I've come here to give you the opportunity to resolve this cleanly. Come with me to Harlan's Crossing. We proceed with the arrangement as agreed. The matter of the money and the ticket, we put it aside. He paused. I'm being generous. She looked at him. She looked at his small, calculating eyes and his expensive coat, and the way he had ridden 3 hours, not to ask if Emma had survived her fever, but to assess what his money had been spent on and what reputation he had to recover. My daughter was sick 4 nights ago, she said. You asked about the money before you asked about her. The child is clearly fine because I spent 3 nights fighting for her life. You haven't asked who helped me. You haven't asked whether she was in danger. You came in and looked at the curtains and decided I'd been comfortable. She heard her voice going flatter as she went, the particular flatness that wasn't cold but was resolved. The ticket is missing because I dropped it on a train when a stranger told me to get off at the wrong stop while I was holding my daughter in a blizzard. I have no way to prove that to you, but you could choose to believe me. You chose not to. Victor Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the sheriff. The sheriff looked like a man who very much did not want to be part of whatever came next. Sheriff, Victor said, Mrs. Carter received funds from me under the understanding that she would travel to Harlan's Crossing and enter into a legal marriage arrangement. She failed to appear and has spent those funds. I'd like you to explain the relevant statute. Mr. Ashford, the sheriff said carefully, this isn't exactly straightforward. The statute, Victor said again. The sheriff looked at Naomi. He had the expression of someone watching a situation go in a direction they knew was wrong but couldn't legally prevent. "Ma'am," he said, and she could hear the apology in it. "In the absence of documentation of the ticketing error, the funds could be considered, there's a question about whether—" He stopped and started again. "Mr. Ashford is alleging that the money was received and not fulfilled. Without your ticket, you've got no documentation to the contrary." "I know," Naomi said. She said it quietly. She said it the way she said things when she had looked at the situation clearly and found no angle that resolved it in her favor and had decided to be precise about that rather than pretend otherwise. "Are you placing me under arrest?" she asked the sheriff. He looked at Victor Ashford. Victor Ashford looked at Naomi with the expression of a man who has found the leverage he was looking for. "That depends," Victor said, "on what you decide to do next." Behind her, she heard Silas take one step forward. "Don't," she said, without turning around. Not to stop him from defending her, she knew he would have, but because this moment was hers, and she needed it to be. She looked at Victor Ashford, and she thought about the letters with the careful handwriting, and the money order, and the plan she'd made when everything in Ohio had been ash and silence, and she'd needed something to step toward. She thought about what he was offering now, which was the same arrangement dressed up in different terms, and what it would cost to take it. She thought about Emma, behind her on the blanket. "Where's my ticket?" she asked. Victor blinked. It wasn't the response he'd expected. "I beg your pardon?" "My ticket," she said. "If I'm being accused of something, I'd like to know what happened to the document that proves I didn't do it. The railroad says it has no record of an error. That means either the record was never made, or someone made it disappear." She held his gaze. "I'd like to know which one." Victor's expression went entirely still. The sheriff was looking at him now. "That's an accusation," Victor said softly. "It's a question," she said. "I'm simply asking about a piece of paper." The silence in the room stretched out. Emma made a small sound on her blanket. Not distress, just the sound of a baby reaching the limit of her tolerance for being ignored. And Naomi heard Silas cross the room behind her and pick Emma up, which was so casually competent that it broke something open in her chest even in the middle of everything else. "I'll need to come with you," Naomi said to the sheriff, "if that's what's happening." "It doesn't have to happen today," the sheriff started. "Yes, it does," Victor said. The sheriff looked at Naomi and something moved in his face that she recognized as a kind of helpless decency, a man who knew what was right but lacked the immediate authority to enforce it. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. She turned to look at Silas, who was holding Emma against his shoulder with one arm, Emma's fist in his coat collar, both of them looking at her with the same expression of absolute attention. She held Silas's gaze for a moment. She wanted to say something. She couldn't find what it was. "Keep her warm," she said. "She's still recovering. She'll need—" Her voice did something she hadn't expected, and she stopped and started again. "Keep her warm. She'll want a nurse in the evening. Tell them where to find you." "I'll get you out," Silas said. His voice was the quietest she'd heard it, and entirely certain. "Whatever it takes to find that ticket, I'll find it." She nodded once. She turned and walked toward the door, and Victor Ashford stepped aside to let her pass, and the sheriff followed, and the cold hit her when she stepped onto the porch like a reminder of the first night, the platform, the blizzard, the station master's closing door. She didn't look back. She heard Emma start to cry from inside the cabin, the specific cry of a baby whose mother has just walked away, and she kept walking because if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to start again. Behind her, she heard Silas's voice, low, steady, talking to Emma. The crying didn't stop, but it shifted, became something less desperate, and Naomi walked across the snow toward the sheriff's horse thinking about the ticket she'd had in her inner pocket, the one she'd been sure of, the one that had been there when she boarded at Millhaven and had not been there when she'd checked in the dry goods store. She thought about where a piece of paper goes when it leaves a coat pocket. She thought about Silas's wagon, which had been at the station that night. She thought, he'll find it, and she thought, I hope I'm right about him. She had, at this point in her life, a complicated relationship with hope. It had let her down before and she'd kept using it anyway, because the alternative was worse. She'd hoped in Ohio, and it had not saved Thomas. She'd hoped on the train, and it had not kept her on the right road. She'd hoped in the letters from Victor Ashford, and she was currently walking to a sheriff's horse in the snow, with nothing but her coat and her name, and the particular stubborn conviction that the truth was still the truth, regardless of who believed it. She kept walking. The cold was very clear and very bright, the way it gets after a storm when the sky has been scoured clean and everything is sharp-edged and merciless and you can see for miles, and nothing is hidden, and everything is exactly what it is. The jail in Iron Ridge was not built for long-term use. It was one room at the back of the sheriff's office, separated from the front by a plank door with an iron bolt, containing a cot with a straw mattress, a bucket, and a single window set high in the wall that let in a rectangle of pale winter light. The kind of room that said, "We don't expect you to be here long." Whether that meant they expected to release you or expected to move you, the room didn't specify. Sheriff Dale Purvis locked the bolt with the expression of a man performing a task he found distasteful. He was perhaps 45, with a gray beard kept short and eyes that had the settled quality of someone who'd seen enough to be neither easily surprised nor easily hardened. He'd said very little on the ride into town. Victor Ashford had ridden ahead, which had been its own kind of statement. "I'm going to get you some food," Purvis said through the door. "And water. If you need anything else, knock 3 times. "Sheriff?" she said. He paused. "My daughter is still recovering from a fever. She's at the Boone Ranch. She's nursing, which means she'll need—" She stopped. There was no way to finish that sentence that didn't sound like what it was, which was a mother asking a man to understand something he had no framework for. "She needs me. However long this takes, please be aware that a sick infant is involved." Purvis looked at her for a long moment. "I know that, Mrs. Carter," he said, and closed the door. She sat on the cot and put her hands on her knees and looked at the rectangle of winter light in the high window. She thought about Emma's cry when she'd walked away from the cabin, the way it had shifted when Silas spoke. She thought about whether Emma would take food from a spoon yet. She'd started a few weeks ago, tentative, making faces at everything, but she'd taken mashed potato from Naomi's finger on 2 occasions without spitting it out immediately, which counted as progress. She thought about whether Silas would know that, whether he'd think to try, whether— She stopped. She was spiraling, which wasn't useful. She took a breath and did what she always did when the thinking got too circular. She went practical. She organized what she knew. Victor Ashford had ridden 3 hours to confront her rather than send another telegram, which meant he'd been angry enough to come himself or confident enough in his position that he'd wanted to be present for it. He'd invoked the sheriff, which meant he'd planned this before arriving. He'd known the sheriff would be riding back with him. He'd offered her a way out. Come to Harlan's Crossing, proceed with the arrangement, put the whole thing aside, which meant he still wanted to proceed, which meant whatever else he was doing, this was pressure rather than punishment. He was not trying to send her to a territorial prison. He was trying to give her fewer options until the one option he wanted looked like the only one left. She understood men like that. She'd encountered a version of one before, though less refined. The method was the same. Reduce the space around a person until compliance looks like freedom. She wasn't going to Harlan's Crossing. She'd known that since the moment he'd looked at the curtains and calculated what his money had purchased. She'd known it even before that, probably, somewhere in the long nights of the second week when she'd been reading his letters by lamplight and feeling the distance between the man on the page and something she couldn't yet name. But knowing a thing and being ready to say it out loud were different, and she was ready now. She was not going to marry Victor Ashford. She would figure out the rest from there. Silas found the ticket 4 hours after Naomi was taken. He'd started looking before Victor's horses had cleared the property line, because he'd had a thought the moment Naomi had mentioned it in the cabin. Where does a piece of paper go when it leaves a coat pocket? And he'd walked the distance between the station and the ranch in his mind and landed on the same place she had. He put Emma in the wrap he'd watched Naomi use, which took 3 attempts to get right, and resulted in Emma regarding him with profound skepticism throughout, and drove the wagon to the station. The station master, a man named Ord, who owed Silas a minor favor from a fence dispute 2 years prior, let him poke around the platform and the area beside it without asking too many questions. Silas checked the platform boards first, the spaces between them where things fell through, and found nothing but old snow and a rusted nail. He checked the loading area beside the tracks, where passengers off a train would have stepped down. The snow had been packed and repacked by several storms since that first Monday, but the edge of the platform, where it met the wall of the supply shed, was partially sheltered by the overhang. He found the ticket wedged in the gap between the platform boards and the shed wall, 9 inches down, folded in half the way a person folds something they've been carrying in a pocket. The ink had bled in one corner from moisture, but the printing was still clear. The date, the route, the destination, the junction at Millhaven clearly marked. He stood there in the cold with Emma strapped to his chest and held the ticket in both hands and read it 3 times. Then he went to find Crail at the telegraph office. The message he sent was to the railroad's regional office at Millhaven, not the local station master who'd already been a dead end, but the dispatch office, which kept its own records separate from the ticketing desk. He asked specifically about irregular conductor assignments on the date in question, on the line running west from Millhaven Junction. He sent a second message to a man named Roy Hatch in Millhaven, who was a surveyor by trade and a careful talker by nature, and who Silas had known for 11 years. The message asked Roy whether he knew anything about a conductor named, and here Silas paused because Naomi had never given him a name, only a description, and he described him instead, older or middle-aged, working the Millhaven line the first Monday of that month. He did not know if either message would produce anything useful in time. He went back to the ranch, put Emma down, and fed her the mashed potato she viewed with suspicion and eventually accepted, and thought about what else he could do. The town meeting was not his idea. It was Margaret Fenway's. Margaret Fenway was 71 years old and had lived in Iron Ridge since before it was called Iron Ridge, when it was 3 buildings and a postmarker on a trail to nowhere. She was small and dry and looked like she could be knocked over by a strong wind, which was an impression she had spent decades cultivating because it made people underestimate her, and she liked being underestimated. She'd been watching the situation with Naomi Carter from the beginning, not with the gossipy interest of Patrice Dunham, but with the focused attention of a woman who had seen many things arrive in frontier towns and knew the difference between a problem and a person. She came to the ranch Tuesday morning while Silas was in the barn. He heard her wagon and came out to find her already hitching her own horse with the efficient irritation of someone who doesn't wait for help. "You found the ticket," she said. "It wasn't a question. Yesterday. And you've sent telegrams." 2. Margaret looked at him. "The Ashford man is staying at the Copper Nail. He's been talking to people." She said it the way you report weather, factual, without drama. He's not saying she stole from him directly. He's using the word irregularities. He says he came out here out of concern for a vulnerable woman who found herself in a compromising situation. Silas kept his expression level. "He's framing it so the story about him is that he's being gracious," Margaret continued. "The story about her is that she got herself into trouble and he's willing to overlook it if she cooperates." She pulled her coat straighter. "People are listening. Not everyone, but enough." "What do you want me to do about it?" Margaret looked at him with the specific patience of a woman who has had to explain things to capable men her entire life. "Call a town meeting. Tonight, if you can manage it. The feed store has a big enough room, and Hector Cullum owes you a favor." "I'm not a public speaker," Silas said. "You don't have to be pretty about it," Margaret said. "You just have to be true." She untied her horse and climbed onto the wagon with the agility of someone whose bones hadn't gotten the message that she was 71. "You found the ticket. You know what happened. You know what kind of woman she is." She picked up the reins. "The question is whether you're willing to say it where people can hear it." He stood in the yard after she'd gone and looked at the cabin for a long moment. Emma was inside, asleep. He could hear her through the open barn door, the small sounds she made in sleep that he had gotten used to over the last 2 weeks, with a speed that he hadn't examined closely, because examining it would have led somewhere he wasn't sure he was ready to go. He went inside and picked up his hat. The feed store meeting room held 30 people. It held 42 that Tuesday evening. Silas arrived early enough to set up and found that Margaret Fenway had gotten there before him and arranged the lanterns in a way that lit the space without making it feel like a courtroom, which he recognized as a deliberate choice on her part. She'd also managed to get Roy Hatch's reply, which had come into the telegraph office that afternoon, into Silas's hand before he walked through the door, which meant she'd been monitoring the wire, which he was not surprised by at all. He read the telegram twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket next to the ticket. People came in ones and twos and in small clusters. He recognized most of them. Iron Ridge was not a large town, and he'd been here long enough to know the faces even when he didn't always know the names. Patrice Dunham arrived with two women from the south end of town and took a position near the back that gave her a good view of the whole room. Hector Colum stood near the door. Ord from the station came in late and stood against the wall. Victor Ashford came in at 5 past the hour, alone, and took a seat near the front with the composure of a man who is present at a proceeding he expects to control. He looked at Silas as he sat down. Silas looked back at him. Sheriff Purvis had come too, which Silas had not arranged for but was glad of. He was standing to one side with his arms folded, not officiating, just present, which was exactly the right thing. Silas stood at the front of the room and waited until the movement settled. He was not a man who liked being looked at by large numbers of people. He'd known this about himself for years. He was the kind of person who did his best thinking alone or in small groups and who distrusted spectacle on principle. But he'd been thinking about Naomi walking across the snow toward the sheriff's horse with her back straight and her hands at her sides and not looking back. And he'd decided that his discomfort was not the issue at hand. "Most of you know me," he said. His voice carried without effort in the enclosed space. "Some of you know what's happened this week. I want to make sure all of you know what actually happened, because there are two versions going around and only one of them is true." He started from the beginning, not from when he'd found her in the barn, from before that, from what he'd pieced together afterward, and from what she'd told him. The train from the east, the junction at Millhaven, the conductor who told her this was her stop, the blizzard, an infant in below-freezing temperatures and nowhere in town willing to take them in. He saw a few people shift when he said that last part. He didn't soften it. He talked about the 2 weeks. Not sentimentally. He wasn't built for sentiment in public. And anyway, sentiment wasn't the point. He talked about what she'd done, the window chinking, the root cellar, the barn tools, the shirts. He talked about Emma's fever on the Sunday night, the blizzard, the 20 miles of impassable road between them and the nearest doctor. He talked about Naomi spending the entire night working, not panicking, not collapsing, working, with everything she had and nothing but what was in that cabin to work with. "Emma Carter is 9 months old," he said. "She survived because her mother didn't stop." The room was quiet. He took the ticket out of his coat pocket and held it up. "I found this yesterday afternoon, under the platform boards at the station, 9 inches down, wedged against the supply shed wall. It's the ticket Mrs. Carter was issued for travel from the Millhaven Junction to Harlan's Crossing." He paused. "The date on this ticket is the Monday she arrived in Iron Ridge. The route on this ticket is the one she described." He heard Victor Ashford shift in his seat. "The railroad told Mr. Ashford there was no record of a ticketing error," Silas continued. "That's true. There wasn't a ticketing error. There was a conductor who wasn't rostered on that line." He pulled Roy Hatch's telegram from his pocket. "Roy Hatch is a surveyor in Millhaven. He knew the man by name, a conductor named Ferris, who occasionally worked substitute routes and who, according to Roy, has a documented history of putting passengers off at the wrong stops and then claiming they misunderstood. The railroad knows about him. They've been slow to act on it because he has a brother-in-law in the dispatch office." The room was not quiet anymore. Victor Ashford stood up. "Mr. Boone," he said, and his voice had the same controlled quality as his face, the voice of a man who is presenting calmness as a strategy. "This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the essential facts. Mrs. Carter received funds from me and failed to fulfill the agreement." "She received funds for a train ticket," Silas said. "She used them for a train ticket. The train put her off 200 miles from where she was going through no fault of hers or yours. The money is accounted for. The ticket is in my hand." He held Victor's gaze. "What exactly is your complaint?" Victor's color had risen slightly. "My complaint is that she spent 3 weeks in another man's home without notifying me of her situation for the first 10 days. She sent a telegram the morning after she arrived. And when I came to resolve the matter, she was taking care of her daughter, who'd nearly died 4 days before you showed up," Silas said. "You want to tell this room what the first thing you said to her was?" Victor stopped. "Because I was there," Silas said. "I watched you walk into my house and look around at what she'd built in 3 weeks with nothing, and the first thing out of your mouth was that she'd made herself comfortable." He paused. "You didn't ask about the baby. You didn't ask whether she was well. You started calculating." The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silence. Silas could feel the room reconsidering. the way a room does when it's been looking at something from one angle and suddenly has to adjust. "I'd like Mrs. Carter released," Silas said to Purvis. "Tonight. The ticket is here. The explanation for the conductor is corroborated by an independent source, and the funds have been accounted for. There's no basis for the allegation." Purvis had been listening with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. He looked at Victor Ashford now, then back at the room, then at the ticket in Silas's hand. "I'll need to see that telegram," he said. Silas handed it to him. Victor Ashford looked at the room. 42 people looked back at him. Patrice Dunham, near the back, was very still in a way she hadn't been when she'd arrived. Hector Colm's expression was something Silas didn't need to interpret closely. "Mr. Ashford," Purvis said, "I'd appreciate it if you remained in town until I've had a chance to review this documentation. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow morning." It was not an arrest, but it was something. Victor Ashford sat back down, slowly, with the careful composure of a man who knows that standing up again too fast will look like what it is. Purvis released Naomi at 9 that evening. He came to the back room and unbolted the door without preamble and stood in the doorway. "You're free to go, Mrs. Carter," he said. "The complaint has been withdrawn, pending documentation review, but I don't anticipate any further issues." She stood up from the cot. She'd been sitting very still for the past 2 hours, which was how she waited when there was nothing useful to do. Not pacing, not catastrophizing, just still, conserving something. "The ticket was found?" she said. "Under the station platform." He paused. "And there's information about the conductor. I won't go into all of it tonight, but it lines up with what you told me." She nodded. "She didn't say I told you. There was no point in it." "Is there someone?" Purvis started. The front door of the sheriff's office opened. Silas came through it with Emma in the wrap at his chest, Emma's head lolling against his shoulder in the particular floppy way of a sleeping baby who has given up fighting it. He stopped when he saw Naomi. They looked at each other across the length of the small office. Emma made a sound in her sleep, not waking up, just resettling, and Silas put his hand on her back automatically, without looking down, keeping his eyes on Naomi. "She took the potato," he said. "Eventually." Naomi laughed. It came out slightly wrong, slightly cracked at the edges. "Which was what happened when you'd been holding yourself together in a jail cell for 7 hours and then someone said something ordinary." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a second. "Of course she did," she said. She crossed the room and Silas reached up and carefully transferred Emma from the wrap into Naomi's arms. Emma stirred, felt her mother, and sagged with the absolute surrender of a baby who has found what she was looking for and has no further complaints. Naomi held her and breathed. "Thank you," she said into Emma's hair. "The ticket was under the platform," Silas said, 9 inches down. "I thought it might be." "I know. You told me to look." He hadn't said that on the night. She'd said, "I hope he looks," to herself walking across the snow. But something in the way he said it made her think he'd known anyway. That's Victor Ashford came to find her the next morning. She was at the feed store buying flour with Margaret Fenway. Margaret had appeared at the ranch at 8 in the morning and told Naomi that she was taking her into town, and Naomi had understood that this was not optional and had come. They'd spent the morning doing ordinary errands, and Naomi had felt the town around her differently than she'd felt it 3 weeks ago. Not warm, exactly. Iron Ridge was not a town of excessive warmth, but recalibrated. People who hadn't spoken to her before said her name in the street. Mrs. Holt from the dry goods store came out onto the step and asked after Emma's health, which was not what she'd done when Naomi had needed a room in a blizzard, but was something. Victor found her alone at the counter while Margaret was in the back discussing something with Hector Colm. He was not what he'd been the day before. Not defeated. She didn't think Victor Ashford did defeat exactly, but different. The performance of controlled displeasure was gone, and what was underneath it was harder to read. He was a man who was used to outcomes going his way, and they hadn't, and he was deciding what to do about that. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I was perhaps hasty," he said. "In my approach." She didn't say anything. "The situation appeared to me—" He paused. "I came out here prepared for a particular kind of problem, and I think I may have been looking at what I expected rather than what was there. It was," she thought, about as close to an apology as this man had probably come in a number of years. She recognized the effort of it, the cost, and she acknowledged it accordingly. "I understand why it looked the way it looked," she said. "From a distance." He nodded. There was a moment of silence that was not quite comfortable but was not combative either. Then he said, "The original arrangement stands if you want it. I recognize that the situation was not your fault, and I'm prepared to say so." She looked at him. She thought, there it is. Not the offer of yesterday, which had been a trap dressed as a lifeline. This was different. This was a man making a genuine recalibration, offering something real. She could see that. She gave him credit for it. She thought about what the offer meant. A ranch in Harlan's Crossing, a name, financial stability for herself and Emma. A man who was not kind, but was, she thought, fair, or capable of fair, when he wasn't operating from a position of threatened pride. She thought about the letters with their careful handwriting, and about what kind of life they were offering, and about whether that life was one she could build something real inside of, or whether it was the kind that required constant managing and would use her up doing it. She thought about what she'd built in 3 weeks in a stranger's house. She thought about Emma in Silas Boone's lap, examining a bean. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I do, genuinely." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to take it." Victor Ashford looked at her for a long moment. "Is it Boone?" he said, not with anger, with the flat, informational tone of a man trying to understand a variable he'd misjudged. "It's not one thing," she said. "It's everything." She paused. "You're a man who wanted a wife and sent careful letters and made an arrangement, and then, when it got complicated, the first thing you thought about was what it looked like and what you'd spent. I understand why. That doesn't make it what I need." He looked out the window for a moment. "And what is it that you need, Mrs. Carter?" She thought about it honestly. "Someone who asks about the baby first," she said. Victor Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he's received information he can process even if it's not what he wanted, and turned and walked out of the feed store. She watched him go and felt the thing she'd been bracing against for 3 weeks release its tension somewhere along her spine. Margaret Fenway found her at the counter, standing with her hands flat on the flour sack and her face pointed at the door. "Well," Margaret said. "He offered to continue the arrangement," Naomi said. "And?" "I declined." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that Naomi, in time, would come to recognize as the sound Margaret made when she had expected exactly this outcome and was satisfied about it. "And what are you going to do?" Naomi picked up the flour. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true in the specific sense, and not entirely true in the broader one, because she had a pretty clear idea of what she was going to do and was not quite ready to say it to another person yet. "You could stay in Iron Ridge," Margaret said, as if it were a mild observation about the weather. "I could," Naomi said. "The schoolhouse has been without a teacher for 8 months. The town's been arguing about what to do about it." Naomi looked at her. Margaret looked back with the expression of a woman who has placed something on a table and is now waiting for someone else to decide whether to pick it up. "I taught school," Naomi said, "in Indiana, for 3 years. "I know," Margaret said. "I asked around." "You asked around," Naomi repeated. "I'm old and I'm thorough," Margaret said. "Come on, I'll buy you coffee." She talked to Silas that evening, after Emma was asleep. She'd been working out how to say it all day, not because it was complicated, but because there were several things braided together and she wanted to be precise. She didn't want to be the woman who turned down one man and then turned to the nearest other one and presented herself as a solution to his loneliness. She was not a solution to anyone's loneliness. She was a person with a daughter and a history and opinions about root cellar organization, and if she was going to stay in Iron Ridge, it was going to be on those terms. She sat down across the table from him after dinner and said, "I want to talk to you about something." He folded his hands on the table. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention he had, which was the kind that didn't waver or get distracted, and which she'd decided was one of the most useful things about him. "Margaret told me the schoolhouse needs a teacher," she said. He waited. "I taught school before," she said. "In Indiana. I was good at it. If the town would have me, after all of this." It might be possible to arrange a salary and housing. Margaret would have you, Silas said. So would half the room last night, possibly more. That's last night, she said. People are generous at meetings. Some of them are, he said. Margaret isn't generous when it doesn't count. If she said it, she means it. Naomi nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. I want to be clear about what I'm saying, she said. I'm not asking to stay here. I don't want you to think that I turned Ashford down and then walked in here with the same proposition in a different coat. Silas was quiet. I'm saying that I might have a way to stay in Iron Ridge independently. That's separate from... She stopped. From whatever else might or might not. Naomi, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with a directness that was not comfortable exactly, but was so plainly honest that it didn't feel threatening. I know what you're doing, he said. You're making sure you have your own ground to stand on before you talk about anything else. That makes sense. That's right. He paused. I'm not going anywhere. Take the time you need. She looked at him across the table. She thought about what it meant that he'd said that. She thought about the fact that he'd gone to the feed store meeting and stood in front of 42 people, a man who did not like being looked at by large numbers of people, which she'd understood about him within the first week, and said the things he'd said. Not for a complicated reason, because they were true, and because she needed someone to say them. She thought about Emma on his shoulder, sleeping, while he walked through the sheriff's office door. I found the schoolhouse key in Margaret's coat pocket this morning, she said. She'd apparently already gotten it from the town council. Sounds like Margaret, Silas said. She's terrifying, Naomi said. She is, he agreed, and there it was again. The thing his face did that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same family. She'd started cataloging these because they were infrequent and therefore worth noting. She stood up and went to the stove to check the damper for the night, and Silas stayed at the table, and the fire burned down in the easy way it did when the room was warm enough and didn't need it to work hard. Silas? She said, without turning around. Yeah. Victor asked me if it was you. She kept her hands on the stove lever. I told him it wasn't one thing. It was everything, she paused. That was true, but it was also you. She heard him breathe. Okay, he said, just that. She turned around. He was still at the table, hands folded, looking at her with that full, undeflecting attention. Okay, she said back. She went to bed. She lay on the floor blanket and listened to Emma breathe in the darkness above her and felt the shape of the week settling around her. The jail cell, Victor Ashford's careful recalibration, Margaret and the schoolhouse key. The meeting with 42 people and Silas's voice carrying in the lantern light. She felt the shape of the 3 weeks before it, everything that had been built and nearly broken and held together by the specific combination of stubbornness and exhaustion and someone deciding not to look away. She thought about the schoolhouse. She thought about what it would mean to teach again. The sound of a classroom. The particular work of finding the angle that makes something make sense for a person who hasn't found it yet. She'd been good at that. She wanted to be good at it again. She thought about ground, about standing on it. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that comes after trouble has passed and the air has been washed out and everything is very still. And in the morning, there will be ice on the water barrel and frost on the window glass, and the ranch would be there. And Emma would wake early as she always did, and Silas would come in from the barn with cold, chapped hands and say something quietly useful, and the day would be ordinary in all the ways that extraordinary things eventually become. And she would let it. She closed her eyes. For the first time and longer than she could easily account for, she went to sleep without running the arithmetic first. The schoolhouse key sat on the shelf above the stove for 3 days before Naomi used it. Not because she was uncertain, she'd made her decision the morning Margaret had pressed it into her hand with the particular efficiency of a woman who considers hesitation a personal failing. But there was a difference between deciding and doing, and in the space between the two she found herself moving through the ranch with a new kind of attention, the way you look at a place when you're trying to fix it clearly in your mind before something changes. She noticed things she hadn't let herself notice before. The way the morning light came through Clara's curtains and lay across the plank floor in long, warm strips. The specific silence of the ranch at 6 a.m. before Silas came in from the barn. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full, that has the weight of something settled in it. Emma had started pulling herself up on furniture that week, hauling herself upright on the leg of the table or the edge of the cot with a determination that was completely characteristic of her, and then standing there, wobbling with an expression of astonished triumph before sitting back down hard. She did this repeatedly, without frustration, each time like the first time, and Silas had started positioning himself on the floor nearby when she was at it without being asked, close enough to catch her if the wobble went too far. Naomi had watched this from the stove one morning and thought, some things don't announce themselves. They just become true while you're looking at something else. On Thursday, she put on her coat, put Emma in the wrap, picked up the key, and walked to the schoolhouse. Autumn. It was on the north end of the main street, a square building with a bell that had lost its rope sometime in the past year. Inside, 12 desks, a blackboard still carrying the ghost of a lesson in subtraction, a wood stove that needed its flue cleaned, shelves of readers and arithmetic primers that were outdated but usable. 2 of the windows had cracked panes that let the cold in at the corners. The floor was thick with dust and the smell of a space that had been closed too long. Naomi stood in the center of it with Emma on her hip and looked around. She thought about her classroom in Indiana, smaller, with a leaking roof she'd spent 2 years petitioning the county to fix. She thought about the children who'd come through it, the boy who'd been told he was stupid and turned out to be the sharpest reader in the class once someone showed him the right angle in. The girl who'd done arithmetic in the margins of every other subject's papers because she couldn't stop herself. The ones who'd come in hungry and learned anyway, out of sheer bloody-mindedness, which was a quality Naomi had always respected because she'd needed it herself. Well, she said to Emma. Emma looked at the blackboard with the focused attention she gave new things. It needs work. She started that afternoon. She cleaned the flue herself, which was a filthy job that left her with soot in her hair and on her face, and feeling better about the project than she had going in, because a dirty job completed was always satisfying in a way that a clean one wasn't. She swept the floor twice. She examined the cracked window panes and made a list of what she needed and priced it against what the town council had offered her for the first month's supplies. The town council had been more straightforward than she'd expected. Margaret had clearly done preparatory work, because when Naomi had met with the 3 men who composed it, 2 of them already seemed to have made up their minds and were primarily concerned with the formality of the thing. The third, a rancher named Briggs who'd been at the meeting and had sat in the second row with his arms crossed for most of it, had asked her a few pointed questions about her qualifications and her intentions regarding permanence, and she'd answered each one directly and without embellishment. "You plan to stay," Briggs had said. It had the quality of a test. "I plan to teach," she'd said. "Whether I stay depends on whether the town will have me and whether I can make it work. I'm not going to promise permanence to get the position and then leave in the spring. If I take this, I mean it." Briggs had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, the same gesture she'd noticed that Silas used when he'd decided something. The salary was modest. With it, she could afford a room. Mrs. Holt had offered one at reduced rate, which was a form of apology Naomi accepted without comment, and food for herself and Emma, and be clear of debt within 2 months if she was careful, which she was. She accepted the position on a Friday and opened the school the following Monday. 9 children came the first day. 3 more came by Wednesday, sent by parents who'd been waiting to see whether the teacher would still be there after the first week, which was a reasonable test under the circumstances. By the end of the second week, she had 14 students ranging from 6 to 13, and a waiting list of sorts, which in Iron Ridge meant 3 families who'd said they'd send their children after the spring planting pressure eased. Teaching was like a language she hadn't spoken in 2 years and found, upon returning, that she hadn't lost. She fell back into the rhythm of it faster than she expected. The particular calibration required when you're managing 14 children at 7 different levels of competency, keeping the older ones from being bored while the younger ones weren't overwhelmed, finding the specific key that unlocks each child's attention. It was problem-solving of a particular kind, the kind that never fully repeated itself because each child was a different problem. And she had always found that kind of work absorbing in a way that left no room for the anxious cycling she was prone to when she had too much unstructured time. Emma came with her for the first week, in the wrap or on a blanket in the corner, until Margaret Fenway showed up on Tuesday morning and said she'd sit with Emma at her house on school days, an offer delivered so matter-of-factly that refusing it felt more complicated than accepting. "You don't have to do that," Naomi said. "I know," Margaret said, and held out her arms for Emma. Emma went to her without hesitation, which settled the question. The arrangement between Naomi and Silas didn't change overnight. It changed the way things had changed between them from the beginning, slowly, without announcement, in the accumulation of small moments that each meant something on their own and meant more in aggregate. She still had a room above the dry goods store. She was still, technically, a boarder in Iron Ridge with her own arrangements and her own earnings and her own life separate from the ranch. This was important to her in a way she'd tried to explain to Margaret one afternoon and hadn't managed entirely, but Margaret had seemed to understand without the full explanation, which was one of the things Naomi valued about her. But she rode out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, which had started the first week as a practical matter. She needed to return a pot she'd borrowed, a transparent excuse that Silas had accepted without visible amusement, and had continued because neither of them saw any reason to stop. On Sundays they cooked together, which was not an arrangement they'd discussed, but had simply become the shape of those afternoons. Silas was not a bad cook, she'd discovered. He was competent in the way of a man who has fed himself alone for years and knows what he needs to know without any additional refinement. Together, they were better than either of them separately, which she thought was probably true of most things. Emma, on these Sundays, became impossible to contain. She was 10 months old now and had added walking to her repertoire. Not reliably, not without grabbing furniture or Naomi's leg, or on one occasion, the tail of Silas's barn cat, who had taken this with better grace than expected. And she regarded the ranch as a territory that required thorough investigation. Silas had taken to moving things up a shelf when he knew they were coming, which Naomi found privately devastating in the particular way that small practical kindnesses are. One Sunday in late February, Naomi arrived to find that Silas had built a low fence across the corner of the barn where Emma had developed a habit of heading directly for the horse's feet. It was not an elaborate structure. 4 boards, a post at each corner, a gate that latched at adult height. He'd sanded the edges so there were no splinters. Naomi stood looking at it for a moment. "She can see the horses from inside it," Silas said behind her. "She seems to want to be near them. This way she can be near them without me having a heart condition." Naomi turned around. He had the careful, slightly braced expression of a man who has done something he can't take back and isn't sure how it will land. "You built her a pen," she said. "I built her an observation area," he said. Naomi looked at the fence, then back at him. Something moved through her that she was only partially able to account for. The specific weight of being known, of someone having watched her daughter carefully enough to understand what she wanted and finding a way to give it to her safely. "That's the kindest thing anyone has done for her in a long time," she said. He looked away, which was what he did when something got too close. "She's a determined child," he said. "She is," Naomi agreed. She takes after her mother." She watched his face do the thing it did, the almost smile, and she thought, "I have been in love with this man for longer than I've admitted to myself, and it is possibly the most inconvenient truth I've ever had to manage, and I am done managing it." She didn't say that, not that day, but she knew it, clearly and without the arithmetic, and that was enough for now. The question of Victor Ashford resolved itself in the practical way that most things in frontier towns do, not with finality or ceremony, but with simple fact. He left Iron Ridge 2 days after the meeting, and the documentation Purvis sent to the territorial court found the complaint withdrawn and the matter closed. Naomi received a brief letter from a solicitor in Harlan's Crossing 6 weeks later, confirming that all claims against her had been formally dropped and that any reimbursement of funds was considered settled by the railroad's acknowledgement of the conductor Ferris's improper conduct. The railroad sent a separate letter, impersonal, formish but present, confirming the same. She read both letters at the kitchen table in her room above the dry goods store, with Emma asleep in the borrowed crib Margaret had produced from somewhere and the lamp turned low. She thought about what she wanted to feel. She tested a few things: relief, vindication, bitterness about the weeks it had taken to arrive. What she actually felt was something quieter. Closure had the reputation of being dramatic. People talked about it like a door slamming. In her experience, it was more like a window left open, finally getting latched. The draft stops. The room is a degree warmer. You notice it because of what's absent: She folded the letters and put them in the tin box where she kept important documents. She went to bed. In the morning, she had 14 children to teach, and a flu that was acting up again, and Emma had cut a tooth in the night and was making her opinions about this known, and life was exactly as full as it needed to be. Silas asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in March, in the barn, while they were both doing completely unromantic things. She'd come out to the ranch after school. The habit of Sunday afternoons had expanded to include Wednesday evenings without either of them making a decision about it, and was helping him work a piece of harness leather that needed conditioning while Emma slept in the wrap on her back, worn out from the tooth and from the sheer project of being 10 months old. He'd been quiet for most of the hour they'd been working, which wasn't unusual. Then he said without preamble, still looking at the leather in his hands, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He was quiet for another moment. She waited because she'd learned that his silences were not stalling. They were thinking, and interrupting them produced inferior results. "I know you've got your own life here now," he said. "Your own room, your own work, your own arrangements. I know that matters to you, and it should." He turned the leather over in his hands. "I'm not asking you to give any of that up." She set down the piece she was working on. "I'm asking whether you'd want to build something here," he said. "With me. For Emma." He paused. "For us, if that's a thing you'd want." He looked up at her then, and she saw in his face the thing she'd always seen there, the directness, the honesty, the specific effort of a man who does not perform emotion well, but is having it anyway, and has decided that honesty is better than elegance. "I'm not Clara," she said. She needed to say it, not as a warning or a competition, but as a clarification, because clarity mattered to her. "I know you know that." "I know that," he said. "And I'm not the woman from the letters that Victor Ashford was expecting. I know that too. I'm a woman with a daughter and strong opinions about root cellars, and a schoolhouse that needs new window panes, and a habit of fixing things that aren't mine to fix. I know," he said. And this time there was something in his voice that was close to a full smile, the real one, which she had seen perhaps 4 times in 3 months and intended to see considerably more of. "Naomi, I know who you are." She looked at him across the barn in the lantern light, with Emma breathing softly against her back, and the horses quiet in their stalls, and the late winter cold held at bay by the walls he'd built and maintained for years on this piece of land. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the blizzard, and the closed doors, and Mrs. Holt's pen, and the saloon, and the terrible arithmetic of 63 cents. She thought about the first night on his floor with a blanket and the fire, telling herself she would leave on Thursday. She had not left on Thursday. She had not left on any Thursday since. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "That's a thing I'd want." He nodded once, the way he always did, but his face was doing something she hadn't seen before, something that was not the almost smile, but the real version of whatever lay beneath it, unhidden for once, quiet and entirely human. He put the leather down. She crossed the barn, and he met her halfway, which was not nothing. They were married in April, on a Saturday, in the feed store because it was the largest room available and more people wanted to come than either of them had anticipated. Margaret Fenway organized it with terrifying efficiency. Emma wore a dress that Margaret had made from cloth Naomi had not been consulted about, and which was impractical and extremely well made, and spent most of the ceremony trying to remove her own shoe. The ceremony was civil, presided over by the circuit judge who came through Iron Ridge every 6 weeks. It was short, because Silas had been very clear about not wanting long, and Naomi had not argued. They said what they meant and meant what they said, which Naomi thought was the irreducible minimum requirement for a marriage and more than most managed. Afterward there was food, a remarkable amount of food, produced by women Naomi had come to know over the months in the way you come to know people when you are teaching their children and living in their town and proving daily by small ordinary actions that you are not leaving. Mrs. Holt had made something with dried apples. Patrice Dunham, in what Naomi chose to receive as the peace offering it probably was, had brought bread that was genuinely excellent. Margaret had made 2 pies and accepted compliments on them with the air of someone who expected no less. Silas stood at the edge of the gathering with the expression of a man who is present at a social occasion by choice and is not entirely regretting it. Emma had gotten herself extracted from her dress shoes and was being passed from person to person with the sociable tolerance she'd developed for being admired, which she accepted as her due. She'd been walking reliably for 2 weeks and was very pleased with herself about it. At some point in the afternoon, Naomi found herself standing near the window, watching the room, and Margaret appeared at her elbow. "Well," Margaret said. "Well," Naomi agreed. "You look surprised." Naomi considered this. "I look at this room and I think, 4 months ago, not one of these people would have let me sleep in their barn." "Some of them would have," Margaret said. "One of them did," Naomi said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's how it usually works. One person, then another, then it becomes a roomful." She sipped her coffee. "The first person is the hard part." Naomi looked across the room at Silas, who was in conversation with Hector Colum and looked like he might survive it. He caught her looking. He didn't do anything particular, just looked back for a moment, the same unhurried attention he'd given her from the beginning, and then turned back to Hector. She thought, belonging is not a place. It's not a town or a house or a piece of paper from a circuit judge. It's a practice. You do it daily, in the small decisions, stay or go, speak or be silent, offer or withhold, and over enough days it becomes a fact. She had not planned for Iron Ridge. She had planned for Harlan's Crossing and a man with careful handwriting and a life she'd designed on paper from the ruins of a different life. The plan had failed in the specific way that plans fail when they encounter the actual world, which is to say completely and early and without warning. What she'd built instead had not come from a plan. It had come from a blizzard and a missing ticket and a man with a lantern in a stable who'd said, "You coming?" As if it were simple, and from her own refusal to become smaller under pressure, and from Emma's laugh in a quiet cabin, and from the daily choice to stay and work and give what she had and trust that it mattered. It had mattered. She thought about the women she'd known who'd spent their lives waiting to be chosen, shaping themselves to what was wanted, trimming the edges of their personalities, the way you trim the edges of a dress to fit a form that wasn't made for you. She understood it. She'd been close to it herself, in the letters, in the plan, in the careful presentation of Naomi, who will not be too much trouble. She understood the particular desperation that produces it, the arithmetic of survival that says, be smaller, be easier, be what he wants, and maybe then you'll be kept. She had been kept, not by being smaller, by being exactly what she was, difficult and capable and willing to re-chink a window in winter with cold fingers and fight for a fever-sick child through the night and stand in front of a man who had power over her circumstances and refused to apologize for the fact of her own existence. She had been kept by being known. That was the thing no letter could arrange. You couldn't advertise for it or select it from a list of available ranchers. It came from being seen, actually seen, in the unedited version with the daughter and the missing ticket and the 63 cents and the strong opinions. And having someone look at all of that and say, all right, and mean it. Tita. The ranch changed with a third person in it who had a permanent claim. Not dramatically. Nothing about Silas was dramatic. But in the way a building changes when it stops being underoccupied. The sounds were different. 2 voices instead of 1. Emma's footsteps, increasingly purposeful, across the floor at dawn. The particular music of a household that includes a child who has learned to walk and has not yet developed any judgment about where. Naomi kept teaching. This had not been up for discussion, and Silas had not tried to make it one. The schoolhouse got its new window panes in May, paid for by the town council, on a budget that Naomi had itemized and submitted with the precision of a woman who knew how institutional money worked and how to make a case for it. She had 20 students by the fall term, and a waiting list that was no longer a euphemism. There were hard days. She would not pretend otherwise, even to herself. Marriage, even to the right person, is a negotiation without an endpoint, a daily revision of 2 separate sets of habits and preferences and tender spots into something that functions without grinding. Silas had silences she sometimes misread. She had a directness that occasionally startled him. He was not easy with softness. She was not easy with being managed, even gently, even well-meaningly. They argued twice in the first month about things that were, on the surface, about the ranch and were, beneath it, about something harder to name, about who got to decide and what it cost to compromise, and whether compromise was surrender. The first argument they got through badly, each of them stiffening and going quiet in their respective ways, and spending a day navigating around the sore place without addressing it. The second one they got through better, because they'd learned something from the first, that the silence after a fight was worse than the fight, and that neither of them was built for sustained coldness, and that the shortest distance between a disagreement and the other side of it was saying the actual thing. He was better at saying the actual thing than she'd expected. She was worse at receiving it than she'd hoped. They worked on both. Emma turned 1 in the summer, and they gave her a party that consisted of the people she'd decided to accept: Margaret, Silas, Naomi, Hector Colum's youngest daughter, who was 6 and had appointed herself Emma's person from the second week of school, and a cake that Emma approached with the focused intensity of someone who has been watching other people eat cake for months and has been waiting for this moment. She ate the cake with both hands, with absolute conviction, and then looked around the table as if challenging someone to object. No one did. Silas watched her with the expression Naomi had first seen in the barn, the quiet, wondering one, the one he didn't always know she was watching for. "She's going to be trouble," he said. "She's going to be remarkable," Naomi said. He looked at Naomi and then back at Emma and said quietly, "Same thing." And Naomi thought, yes, I chose correctly, not because it's easy, but because it's real, and real is the only thing that lasts. There is something people get wrong about survival stories. They assume the point is the surviving, that the whole thing builds toward the moment the danger passes, and after that it's just aftermath, resolution, the credits rolling over something peaceful. But the surviving is only the threshold. What happens after you survive is the actual story. Naomi Carter had survived Ohio. She'd survived the train and the blizzard and the jail cell and Victor Ashford's careful calculation. She'd survived the nights on the floor and the nights with Emma burning and the long, unsupported weeks when no one in Iron Ridge knew her name, except as the woman who'd shown up in the wrong place at the wrong time. What came after the surviving was harder to name and more important. It was the choice, made not once but daily, to stay, to teach, to build something in a town that had not initially wanted her, to love a man who came slowly and meant it completely, to raise a daughter in a place that would know her name from the beginning. She had arrived carrying a baby and a carpet bag and a plan that didn't survive contact with the first blizzard. She left nothing behind when she came to Iron Ridge, not even the plan, which she'd released without a ceremony, the way you release something when your hands are needed for something more urgent. What she found instead was not what she'd been looking for. It never is, in any story worth telling. What she found was what you find when the map runs out, and you have to look at the actual terrain and decide whether you're going to trust your own legs. Something earned, specific, and unmistakably yours. The schoolhouse bell got a new rope in September. Naomi pulled it the first morning of the fall term with Emma on her hip. Emma, who was 13 months old and had opinions about bells and expressed them immediately and at volume, and listened to the sound of it carry across Iron Ridge in the thin autumn air, out over the main street, past the feed store and the dry goods store and the sheriff's office, all the way to the edge of town where the road turned east toward Millhaven and the wider world. Behind her, from the direction of the ranch, she heard the faint sound of a hammer. Silas was repairing the paddock fence before the first frost, the same way he repaired things, methodically, without fuss, because they were in front of him and needed doing. She pulled the bell rope one more time. The children came through the door in 1s and 2s and 3s, stomping snow from their boots, arguing about something, carrying the noise and the cold in with them, the way children always do, filling the room from the floor, up until it was nothing like the dusty, closed-up space she'd unlocked with Margaret's key in January. She set Emma down in the corner with the wooden spoon and the smooth river rock and the small rag doll, the same toys she'd been examining since she was 8 months old and had not yet exhausted. She picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said, and 20 pairs of eyes looked up at her, and the day began.